If we can see that climate change is already going to make this population much more vulnerable, it's important to increase the protection of these species to make sure that other threats are not causing cumulative impacts.
In the spring of 2019, an unusually high number of grey whales were washed up on the eastern Pacific coast of Mexico, the USA and Canada, either dead or dying. They didn't show any signs of having been caught in fishing nets, nor have biologists found any signs of a toxic spill or outbreak of disease that would account for their deaths. They had simply left their breeding grounds in Mexico and never made it back to their feeding grounds in the Arctic.
This was declared an unusual mortality event by NOAA Fisheries in the US, which is an event where a lot of animals are dying and critical or urgent action needs to be taken to figure out what's happening.
So why were the whales dying? Assistant Professor Fredrick Christianson and his team had secured funding in 2017 to study these whales, particularly their migratory patterns, so they were in a unique position to help solve this mystery.
We don't know that much about whales and like what's called bioenergetics. So it's basically like how much energy do they require to function, how much energy does it cost them to grow, how much does it cost to reproduce and to survive and so on. The only way to get this information historically is from whaling records. So we have to kill the whales and measure them and measure how much oil they have, how thick their blubber is and so on.
Professor Christianson has been using drone technology to measure the bioenergetics of whales in a non-invasive way.
So how do the drones work?
We just fly this over the whales at maybe 20-30 meters altitude. It has a camera on board that we face directly down in a perfect 90-degree angle. And if the drone is moving because of wind, there's a gimbal that keeps this camera completely steady. So you always get a perfect picture from above. So we can measure from the photographs the number of pixels, that's the length of the whale, and the width of the whale. We do this when the whale comes up to the surface to breathe, so you can actually clearly see the whole contour of the animal. And by knowing the altitude and knowing the camera focal length, the picture resolution and so on, we can actually convert these pixel measurements to actual meters. So we can measure how long the whale is and how wide it is. And from that we can calculate its volume. And by looking at the volume relative to how long the animal is, we get a metric, so kind of an index of how fat the animal is, so its body condition.
Grey whales were once called devilfish on account of how ferociously they protected their calves from whalers who hunted them to the brink of extinction. Their population has now bounced back, and they play a crucial role in regulating our climate. Their dung fertilises the phyto, or plant plankton, which is a key carbon sequester. Like the blue whale, humpback and right whales, they have baleen, a filter feeding system similar to bristles inside their mouths instead of teeth. They use their baleen to collect shrimp like krill, plankton and small fish found in the cooler northern waters.
Most of these species spend half the year feeding in one location, normally close to the polar regions. And then they use all this energy, they build up these fat reserves that they then carry with them on their bodies, in their bodies, to the breeding grounds during the winter. And during that time, they're not feeding at all. So for them, having really a lot of fat is essential for their reproduction and their survival. So to understand how body condition, how you can measure it and how you can relate it to survival and reproduction is fundamental to understand anything about the ecology of this species.
The drones allowed for many more whales to be easily monitored from the air than with traditional boat-based techniques.
And we can identify the animals from the color patterns on their backs, both from the drone, or if operating from a boat, we can also take pictures of the flank and identify them. So by doing that, we can actually monitor the same individual for as long as they stay in Mexico, basically. We can photograph the same animal over time and measure how its condition changes. We can see how mothers, for example, are getting thinner, whereas their calves are growing in size and so on.
But over the 4 years of monitoring, something shocking was revealed.
We can see a trend in how the population condition changes over the time. All the animals are declining in condition, which would be expected because they're not feeding. But they're declining to a level which is really low before they start heading north. And that level is much lower in 2018 and 19 compared to 2017, which makes me believe that the animals are losing so much condition that they're getting very close to their starvation threshold. And some animals are gonna have passed that threshold and end up dying before they get back to their feeding grounds where they can replenish their energy reserves.
So where along their migration routes are they perishing and why?
It's on the return journey. So if it's caused by starvation, which our data suggest it is, that would kick in most severely at the end of the season, because that will have been the longest period of time that they haven't been feeding.
And do you know what's causing this?
Because we're seeing this decline is happening even when the whales are arriving in Mexico, something is most likely happening in their feeding grounds. So continued research up there to look at the condition of those animals is the most important, I think. And trying to correlate that with climatic effects and prey availability.
Saving these beautiful creatures is part of a much bigger picture of supporting animal populations during unprecedented climate change.
Understanding how the Arctic ecosystem is affected by climate change and how this is affecting the prey of the grey whale will be very valuable in itself. From that we can start making predictions of seeing, given different future scenarios, how can we expect the population of grey whales to respond to this? And I think that will then be very important to regulate other things. I mean, we should try to stop climate change, that's for sure, but that's a major challenge. There's also other threats that face this population, and I think if we can see that climate change is already going to make this population much more vulnerable, it's important to start addressing these other threats in context of that, to say, okay, now we don't have 26,000 grey whales anymore, we're dealing with, let's say, over 15 or 20,000. We have to increase the protection of these species to make sure that other threats are not causing cumulative impacts that can affect this population.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe and hit the bell button below for notifications.